Hello, hi, I'm John Pinder. I'm an independent environmental advisor in the UK, but I also am secretary to the UK and Ireland Lakes Network and an advisor to Global Nature Fund. And Global Nature Fund is one of the associated organisations with Albufeira. And this particular broadcast is on behalf of the Albufeira program, and it's included in their online seminar. Well, I've been working in the water industry for over 40 years now, and mainly in the area of regulation within the water industry for the main government organisation, the Environment Agency. But in the last 15 years or so, I've been progressively more involved, not in the regulatory approach to environmental restoration, but in the development of a partnership approach and what a partnership can bring to the function of environmental restoration and protection. A PowerPoint which hopefully I can now share with you, and hopefully I can introduce to you some of the areas of partnership development that I've found useful in the area where pure science meets social science, and the principles that have proved to be effective in that process. So hopefully you can now see my PowerPoint presentation, and we can start to go through that. First of all, when we started the work on Windermere, we had historically a lack of objectives or standards. Lakes were just too difficult. We had good classification systems for rivers, but that really didn't protect the lakes in any ways. And when we actually look around the UK and elsewhere at shallow lakes, where wetlands are a particularly important feature, that was even more so. And those objectives and requirements for wetlands were not protected whatsoever. In the Lake District, where we had this situation of clear rivers, but a lake that was deteriorating, the position got serious, bearing in mind that it's a high public destination for visitors and holidaymakers, with 20 million visitor days a year just on Windermere Lake itself. So we had the problem of no protective strategy or classification system, and therefore no driver for any associated action. And the legislation was not actually adequate for protecting lakes, and this has really only come about the new European Water Framework Directive and some of the processes that have come in recently associated with ecosystem services. That's probably not surprising, and that's fairly common knowledge. Of course, it wasn't just one objective that was required. There becomes now a whole range of things that are completely legitimate and require protection in that same body of water or wetland. So multiple objectives started to make the problem more complex. And with that complexity is the question about, well, who's responsible and who's best placed? Well, certainly historically, when we had just pure legislation, then that came from government, down from government, and there would be influence to ensure that legislation was appropriate for that particular environment, and it served as well. But as we have started to develop new added values and objectives to these wetlands, there are other organisations that are better placed to deliver those. So as a simple little model here, I've got a table that has values and objectives down and then across the sort of three generic levels from government through NGOs to local groups or even individuals. And this starts to sort of identify how a partnership is required if all of the players that are needed for delivering those values and objectives are going to be involved. I think we're probably all familiar with the three-cornered triangle of sustainability, where there's a balance between the environment, the economy, and the community. But if we look at how that is then delivered by way of a partnership, it's useful to look at that kind of model in the light and in the way that the social scientists look at it. And each has an association or a relationship with the other. And just like we would go into a shop and we hand over money and receive goods, there is an exchange that goes in between these three corners. Well, that's the simple concept with economy, environment, and community or population. But it can actually go right down to the sort of local level, and the same can be true through, if you consider administrations, NGOs, and community groups. And certainly by looking at what those exchanges are, is a useful indication as to how you can start to talk to different organisations and involve them in potential future partnerships. Well, I said that things are getting more complex, and it's no longer a case of just the three corners of sustainability. But the concept of exchanges is very much useful in trying to do things with more than three corners. So we can look at wetland and lake environments where there are industrial interests, there are NGOs, administrations, government agencies, water companies, landowners, and so on. And each one will have a variety of different sort of level of complexity, but all will be complex compared with, say, 20 or 30 years ago, when the linear relationship driven from a higher level was the assumed way of delivering those environmental improvements. So one of the things that we started with was to create a vision or mission statement, something that was a general statement, but it was relevant to all organisations, even though some of those organisations may not actually yet be partners. And we worked quite hard and for quite a while to get the wording right, because it needed to be short and very clear, but it needed to be clear to everybody, people being served, partner organisations, all of the players, and traditionally, as we all know, each organisation has its own language in which it does its business. And of course, that meant that we needed to actually understand where partners or potential partners' businesses, positions and priorities are, because only in that way could we actually start to understand how a sharing and an exchange of what's in it for me could start. And another function that we progressively found was that there needed to be a timescale that reflected the tasks that have to be undertaken, whereas the programme as a whole is probably for the long term and may even be decades. Within that, there are short-term projects and tasks and events within it. All are important and nothing's hierarchical. there was a necessary action to ensure that the public were kept aware and informed as to what will be delivered. What was this environment? Why is it complex? And why is it difficult? And what how should they take part? And therefore it was needed right the way throughout the partnership and its development and management to actually have a language that everybody could share. So for Windermere, we ended up with a very short statement: a healthy Windermere catchment for now, forever. Healthy because that was a generic term that could be interpreted differently depending on what you were doing, whether it was wild swimming or for fishery values. They would have different definitions. Catchment was in the phrase because it became very apparent that the community at large didn't understand how what was done on the catchment as a whole, the watershed, could actually affect the lake. And then we put in for now, forever, because there were instantaneous actions such as a new wastewater treatment plant, but things had to be done forever, and there was therefore a need for major changes, and in this particular case, a cultural shift, so that farming and forestry and tourism all actually operated in a way that was different from the past, and actually had within their sight the recognition that they had a part to play in maintaining a healthy Windermere. So that was one aspect about setting partnerships up. The other part, of course, is to keep it going, and recognizing that projects could be short or long term. I've already mentioned an acknowledgement that there's all partners have actually a very important piece to play, and I've likened it to pieces of a jigsaw. The jigsaw is the big picture, but within that, each piece has a role to play, and is a very important part in actually being able to see the whole picture. Some of them might be small, some of them might be large, but they're all important. The next concept that we came up with was to actually quantify in overall terms, in monetary terms, the effort that was being put in, and that would include in-kind contribution, because that gives us the opportunity to demonstrate that there is some gearing. That means that if one organisation can deliver a lot of voluntary work, that has a monetary value, and it should be put into the overall equation for how much that restoration is costing. The advantage to all organisations was that their modest investment of either time or money was to the benefit that they would be buying into a much larger costed program. So that, for instance, if one organisation could only modestly put in a small sum, they could actually claim to their corporate organisation that they were, for their small investment, they were getting a large output. And each partner did a similar exercise to demonstrate the efficacy of their investment. Celebrating achievements is particularly important for not only future engagement of new people and generating continued interest, but also in maintaining the focus of those partners rather than them become disinterested. And this takes considerable energy and ingenuity of demonstrating how things are changing and how that particular organisation is a key player in the overall partnership. Maximising the role for local action and stewardship becomes progressively important, because, as we all know, with the passage of time, administrations have got a huge number of different priorities that are all vying for the same pot of money. And no organisation can have one particular objective, such as a wetland environment, at top of its priority forever. So in the long term, there is a sense in terms of a partnership approach to recognising that will be a transition from agency or government, local government-led action to one of local stewardship, and where local communities, whether they are whether they're groups or whether they're interest groups or NGOs, will be progressively taking a greater proportion of the responsibility over time, until such time as it's actually driven at a local level. Inevitably, these projects and programs are instigated by one or two people who've got either a vision or and with that energy and the incentive to drive these programs forward. But of course, that energy doesn't last forever, and it's necessary to actually nurture new leaders as the program progresses. And certainly putting the program into the core educational outputs, such as in schools and into colleges and universities, is a means of actually ensuring that there is a source of future leaders for these programs. Because these children, even at an early age in school, will eventually become the farmers, the foresters, politicians, and so on. So it's important to actually have education as a source of leaders for the future. I mentioned earlier that the historic and traditional way of delivering was for there to be a policy or a legislative need, and also the funding from either central or regional or local government. And then they appointed a delivery body. There may be some public awareness, but then there was a delivery. So it was a linear process, and that still goes on, and it's still a very efficient way of delivering some functions. But the partnership approach looks at things really quite differently, and that particular environment, in this case a wetlands, there's a whole lot of different interfaces with it. And there are, going back to the model that I showed you at the beginning, there is an exchange, and there are benefits and contributions. It's that exchange that all need defining, and all of those are possibly necessary where an environment is going to be supported and improved where that's necessary. Certainly government departments at local, regional or national level are still important, but there are other players that can actually deliver a great deal and gain a great deal from active engagement. The important thing from the perspective of the partnership managers is to actually understand the language that all of those organizations have, and actually to talk to them in a way that engages them with that environmental protection or restoration. I'll leave you with a picture of a crannog. This is a reinstated or rebuilt crannog from 3,000 to 5,000 years ago on Loch Tay in Scotland. This is where Neolithic man chose to live, and he lived there for a number of reasons. You can see there that there's flood protection, food and water supply, shelter, protection from animals and weather, access to trade with other communities, recreation, but probably the most important is well-being. Now, we call these things today ecosystem services, and a Neolithic man just knew how important wetlands were as an environment compared with other environments in his at that particular time. But lakes and wetlands were essential for their well-being and indeed survival. So it's interesting to see that this isn't anything new, and neither is a partnership approach. It's been known for some 5,000 to 7,000 years. We've just put it into new language. I hope that that's been useful for you, and thank you for your attention.